The MIT Enterprise Forum of Texas, in association with Houston Public Media, presents Shale Gas Fracking, Sustainable New Energy Paradigm? Brought to you by American Gas Association, committed to the safe delivery of clean natural gas to more than 65 million homes and businesses. Also sponsored by Oil and Gas Journal and Ensley Properties.
So shale natural gas is a big deal. It's a big deal economically in this country and around the world. It's a very big deal in terms of geopolitics. It may change the way Europe and China deal with some of the so-called rogue nations. And also, it's a big deal environmentally. And it's a big deal for a number of reasons. Number one, the number of wells that are being drilled are staggering. Tens of thousands in Texas alone, and thousands in places that have either never had any oil and gas operations, or it's been 100 years or more since they've had those. Secondly, the location of these wells is a big deal. They're no longer in rural West Texas, but they're in suburban Fort Worth, in urban Fort Worth. I went to TCU. There's a well on the campus of TCU. It's changing the way people interact with the oil and gas industry because it's a different set of folks out there, and the impact on a suburban home versus a ranch in West Texas is pretty different. Likewise, the techniques are very different. Obviously, the depth of the drilling, the impact, the size of the impact, the footprint, the pressures of below the ground, the amount of water that's being used, and the amount of wastewater that comes back up like nothing we did before in the oil and gas industry. It's just different, and it's bigger. And I want to say that the environmental impacts of the current practices in the oil and gas operation are unacceptably high. We've got to do better, and we can do better. And EDF has undertaken now a multi-million-dollar effort to improve the regulations and practices of oil and gas, particularly in the shale reservoirs. We're focusing on 14 states that have 85% of the reserves, pushing 5 sets of regulations. And I'm happy to report we're really making progress. And part of it is our effort, but frankly, we could not do it without others. And Dave Neslin is going to speak later. We owe him a great deal of thanks for the amazing progress they made in Colorado with help from very progressive governors on this issue. Pro-gas and pro-environmental governors make a big difference. And they've set the gold standard for the rest of the country. And we're trying to get the rest of the country, including my home state of Texas, to do better in that area and follow your model. But it's also some progressive gas companies who've been out there with us. And I've got to say, tonight's the first time I met Mark Bowling, but my colleagues who are on the ground all over the country praise him and his company for not only what they do, but for being first and not waiting to see what the rest of the industry is doing, but out there saying we can do better. And they're doing it for more than one reason. One is they know if we screw this up, if we keep telling people things are safe when there is at least a small risk and there's a problem, the confidence of the public in the industry and fracking will go down even further than it is now. They also know it's the right thing to do. They're the real people having real impacts, and we got to do something about that. So I want to thank you, Mark, and Southwestern for your leadership. It really means a lot to the country and, frankly, to the environmental community. And I don't know if you all get enough thanks for that, but I know it's not easy to be first. Let me say that while there are significant problems, and I can talk about what they are if anybody has questions, the environmental community, frankly, is wrong. Many in the environmental community are wrong to blame fracking, the breaking of rocks. And yes, the community is using the words differently than the industry, but they're out there saying ban all fracking. That's frankly bad science, and it's also silly politics. 90% of the new onshore oil and gas wells being drilled now use fracking. And I tell my friends, being against fracking is kind of like being against the automobile. You might like it, but there are a whole lot of them out there and they're not going to go away. And frankly, there are a lot of problems, but most of them are not related to breaking of the rocks. Most of the problems, the documented problems, are related to spills on the ground, poor cement jobs, poor casing, those kind of things. And those are the problems the environmental community needs to work with regulators in an industry to solve if we're going to protect people, and quit this stuff about the rocks a mile down or somehow destroying reservoirs 100 feet below the ground. That's just not right, and it does not help the debate. But let me say that the reason why EDF is in this issue is not related solely to protecting neighbors from oil and gas operations. There are great potential benefits from natural gas, shale gas, if we produce it and use it correctly. That's a big if. And I want to spend the rest of my time talking about the potential benefits for global warming from natural gas and what we need to do to realize a lot of those. So a lot of you have seen numbers like this. This is a chart that talks about what we can do to reduce the effects of global warming by switching from coal to, in this case, a mix of 2/3 gas and 1/3 renewables, which is probably a reasonable number in the short term. And you'll see the orange columns there are about the baseline. That's what, if you assume the current leak rate of methane, what the benefit is. And you'll see it's a good number, but it's not as big a number as you sometimes hear, because frankly, we have a big concern about the leakage of methane. CO2 is the principal greenhouse gas, but methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas. Depending on what time frame you look at, it is 25 to 72 times more potent per pound than CO2. So a little bit of methane leaking any place in the process is a big deal. So if you look in the two columns on the left, we get some reductions of total heat forcing effects, a 5.6 reduction by switching from coal to gas and some renewables. But if you reduce the methane leakage from what we are operating as the number, and it's a 2.8% number that EPA is using, and I'll talk about whether that's really a good number or not in a minute, but assume that number for a minute, a good number but not great. If you can reduce the methane leakage by half, you more than double that. Methane leakage matters, and EDF frankly is in this in large part because if we can both switch to natural gas and reduce the leaks, we can make a big difference in a hurry, and we don't have to pass any legislation in Congress, or we don't have to get the UN to have some new accord. And frankly, we don't have time to wait for either one of those things to happen. So let me talk about a little more detail about the benefits of coal versus gas, natural gas, and then gasoline versus natural gas and diesel versus natural gas. And this is a little more complicated than it needs to be, but just look at the solid line in each of these three graphs. So let's start on the right with the coal plants. And what that graph shows us is if the leak rate of methane is 3.2% or less, from day one we're getting benefits in greenhouse gases. If it's more than 3.2% now, we're not getting benefits, and depending on how high the number is, it takes a long time to get benefits. And those lines on the graph are not accidental. The 7.0 number is what Howarth, the professor in Cornell, has estimated. We don't think that number is right, but if you believe his number, it takes a long time, over 80 years, before gas becomes better than coal. There's a study out of NOAA that nobody believes is anything more than a snapshot, but it had the number around 6. That still takes a long time. The industry has EPA's number is 2.8%, and there are some numbers out of industry about half that number. You'll see that while we believe, even with the current estimates, coal is worse for greenhouse gas problems than natural gas, not so true for vehicles. And while we want to be for the Pickens plan and we want to be for American independence with regard to foreign oil, we also don't want to make the climate worse. If you've been in Texas or Colorado or the Northeast or any place else in the world the last 2 years, you probably don't want it to get a whole lot hotter in the summer, and you probably want it to rain a little bit more. So we cannot make the problem of greenhouse gas worse as we move to natural gas. So let me just focus on gasoline for a second. So let me show you, if you use the number from EPA, current number from EPA, and look at how long it would take for natural gas powered vehicles to be better than gasoline, we're at 80 years again. And that includes not only the leaks of the production in the pipelines, but also the fueling and the operation of the cars, where we know the cars tend to leak some methane along the way. That's why people like us are not yet excited about natural gas powered cars and light duty trucks. But if we can cut the number in half, from day one we're getting benefits, and we over time get a lot of benefits. So what we're trying to do along the way is actually figure out the numbers. Mark is right, nobody really knows. Every number out there is crummy, including the ones from industry, including the best one, but not very good number from EPA. So we're working with a number of companies to do 5 different studies about where the methane leaks are, starting with one of the production companies that Mark's company is involved with, and Shale and Chevron and Exxon, a number of big independents, to try to figure out where it is and what we can do about it, all the way to studies of natural gas vehicles and transmission lines, retail electric natural gas companies. So what I would tell you is great opportunity for natural gas to make a big difference. I've not even talked about the local air pollution benefits that are real and immediate, but there's also high risk, and it's high risk not only for the people who are suffering in the neighborhoods, and we got to deal with their problems, and we haven't even talked about dust and trucks and noise and lights, but those are real, and those people are suffering them, and we can reduce those. But also it's about whether to be a game changer on helping us buy a decade of time to get clean technology and renewables in place, or it can make the problem worse and maybe irreversible. So opportunity and risk, we worked with the companies to take advantage of the opportunity.